The loneliness behind the ranch gates. The Whitmore Ranch stretched across the frontier like a kingdom carved from dust and stubborn pride. Endless fences split the dry land into measured pieces, and cattle drifted through the fading sunlight like dark stains against gold. From a distance, the estate looked powerful, almost beautiful. Up close, it felt cold. Elena Whitmore stood alone on the wide porch of the main house, watching servants carry lanterns toward the barn while evening shadows swallowed the hills. Wind stirred the loose strands of her copper-red hair, but she barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the men gathered beside the corral. Her husband's laughter rose above the others. Richard Whitmore stood with local ranchers near the fence, discussing land routes and livestock prices as though the world contained nothing more important. Tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed, even in frontier dust, he commanded attention effortlessly. Years earlier, Elena had mistaken that confidence for warmth. Now she understood the difference. One of the guests glanced toward the porch. "Your wife waiting for you, Richard." Richard looked over briefly before returning to his conversation. "She can wait a little longer." The men chuckled politely. Elena lowered her eyes. The humiliation itself no longer surprised her. What exhausted her was how ordinary it had become. 3 years ago, she had arrived at the ranch believing marriage would bring freedom from the rigid expectations of Eastern society. Richard had promised adventure, partnership, and a life larger than drawing rooms and arranged conversations. For a short time, he had even seemed gentle. Then the ranch expanded. Business replaced affection. Wealth replaced intimacy. Somewhere along the way, Elena transformed from wife into decoration. Another possession displayed beside Richard's horses and acres of land. The front door creaked open behind her. "You should come inside," Clara Bennett said softly. The temperature's dropping. Elena managed a faint smile. Clara had been her closest companion since arriving in the territory. Unlike most women in town, Clara spoke honestly and observed everything. "I'm fine," Elena replied. Clara studied her carefully. "You said that every week for nearly a year." Elena gave no answer. Below the hill, movement near the stables caught her attention. Several ranch hands struggled to restrain a black stallion that kicked violently against its reins. The animal reared high, nearly throwing one man to the ground. Then another figure stepped forward. He moved differently from the others, calm instead of forceful. The stranger approached the stallion slowly, speaking in a low voice Elena could not hear. His dark hair hung loose to his shoulders, and his expression remained steady despite the animal's rage. Within moments, the horse stopped fighting. Even from the porch, Elena felt the sudden stillness surrounding him. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Clara followed her gaze. "An Apache scout Richard hired yesterday. Supposedly he's the best horse trainer in the territory." Elena watched as the man rested a hand against the stallion's neck. The horse lowered its head obediently. "What's his name?" "Takoda." The name lingered strangely in her thoughts. Richard finally climbed the porch steps nearly an hour later, smelling faintly of whiskey and cigar smoke. He loosened his gloves while passing her. "You disappeared from dinner preparations," Elena said carefully. "I was occupied. You promised we would eat together tonight." Richard sighed, as though she had become another problem demanding attention. "Must every conversation feel like a complaint?" "I wasn't complaining. You were disappointed. There's a difference in tone, not meaning." The sharpness in his voice cut deeper because it remained controlled. Richard rarely shouted anymore. Coldness had become far more effective. Before Elena could answer, one of the stable boys came running toward the house. "Mr. Whitmore," the boy called breathlessly. Miss Elena's mare got loose near the south gate. Elena's eyes widened. "Rosemary?" The boy nodded nervously. "She spooked bad." Elena hurried down the steps before Richard could respond. The evening wind had strengthened, carrying dust across the yard. Near the southern fence line, her chestnut mare jerked violently against tangled reins. Several workers hesitated nearby, uncertain how to approach. Then Takoda appeared beside the horse. He reached for the reins carefully, speaking with quiet patience until the mare settled beneath his touch. Elena slowed as she approached, surprised by how quickly the panic disappeared from the animal's eyes. She frightens easily during storms, Elena said. Takoda glanced toward the dark clouds gathering over the horizon. She feels the thunder before people do. His voice was low and steady. Elena stepped closer to take the reins, but the mare shifted suddenly. Her boots slipped against the loose dirt. Before she could fall, Takoda caught her firmly by the waist. For a moment, neither moved. Elena became painfully aware of his hands holding her steady, of the warmth beneath his roughened skin, of how differently he looked at her compared to every man she had known. There was no calculation in his expression, no ownership, no performance, only concern. "You should step carefully near frightened horses," he said quietly. Elena realized she was still staring at him. "I thank you." He released her immediately and stepped back, respectful but distant. Behind them, thunder rolled across the plains. Richard approached from the porch with visible irritation. "Is there a problem here?" Takoda lowered his gaze slightly. "No problem." But Elena noticed the tension in the air before either man spoke again. Richard took the reins from her hand. "Come inside, Elena. The storm's getting worse." She obeyed silently, though her attention drifted backward toward the stables. Takoda remained standing alone beside the restless horses as wind swept through the ranch yard. Lightning flashed briefly across the darkening sky, illuminating his face for a single second before shadow reclaimed him. That night, long after the storm began rattling the windows, Elena lay awake beside an empty space in her bed. And for the first time in years, loneliness no longer felt numb. It felt dangerous. The dangerous comfort between them. The storm passed by morning, but the heaviness it carried seemed to linger over the Whitmore ranch. Elena noticed it first in herself. She moved through the house distracted, pausing mid-conversation and forgetting simple tasks. Servants repeated questions she failed to hear. Even Clara watched her with growing concern during breakfast in town 2 days later. "You look exhausted," Clara said while stirring cream into her coffee. "I haven't been sleeping well." "That isn't what I meant." Elena avoided her gaze. Outside the cafe window, wagons rattled through the muddy street, while ranchers drifted between storefronts. Ordinary life continued around her, yet she felt strangely detached from it. Clara leaned closer. "Richard's been away almost every evening this month. Are things worsening between you?" Elena forced a calm expression. "There's nothing to discuss." "That answer alone tells me there is." Before Elena could respond, the cafe door swung open. Several men entered loudly from the rain-soaked street. Behind them came Takoda. The conversation around the room shifted almost immediately. Some men quieted. Others stared openly. Though the territory depended on Apache trackers during dangerous seasons, prejudice remained stronger than gratitude. Takoda ignored the attention. Water darkened the shoulders of his worn shirt, and his long hair remained tied loosely behind his back. He crossed toward the counter with the same controlled calm Elena remembered from the stables. Then his eyes briefly met hers. A simple glance, yet warmth spread unexpectedly through her chest. Clara noticed immediately. "Oh," she murmured softly. Elena straightened in her chair. "Don't. I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Clara's expression sharpened. "Be careful, Elena." The warning unsettled her because it arrived too early, before anything improper had even happened. Still, Elena thought about Takoda long after leaving town. Later that afternoon, she wandered toward the stables under the excuse of checking on Rosemary. Dust drifted lazily through the warm air while workers repaired fencing near the northern pasture. Takoda stood alone inside the training pen with a black stallion from the stormy night. The horse circled restlessly, muscles tight with distrust. "You never force him," Elena observed as she approached the fence. Takoda glanced toward her. "Force teaches fear. Fear never lasts quietly." The stallion slowed when Takoda extended his hand. Elena watched carefully. "Richard says wild horses must be broken quickly. Your husband believes everything should obey immediately." The bluntness of the statement surprised her. Takoda seemed to realize it as well. I spoke too freely. No, Elena replied softly. You spoke honestly. For the first time, a faint smile touched his face. It changed him completely. The severity she first noticed around him softened into something unexpectedly warm, and Elena felt herself staring longer than she should. To distract herself, she stepped inside the fence carefully. Can you teach me? Takoda hesitated. The horse still doesn't trust easily. Neither do I. The words escaped before she could stop them. Something shifted in his expression then, not pity, but understanding. He guided her slowly toward the stallion, instructing her to breathe calmly and avoid sudden movements. Elena followed carefully while the horse studied her with nervous eyes. Animals feel what people hide, Takoda said quietly. If your mind is unsettled, they already know. Elena rested a trembling hand against the horse's neck. Then this one must think I'm terrified. Takoda stepped closer beside her. No, lonely. The word struck harder than she expected. She looked up at him slowly. You speak as though you know me. I know sadness when I see it. Silence settled between them, thick with things neither intended to reveal. Elena stepped away first. Over the following days, she returned to the stables repeatedly. Sometimes she brought apples for Rosemary. Sometimes she claimed she needed fresh air. Eventually, she stopped inventing excuses for herself altogether. Takoda never encouraged impropriety, yet their conversations deepened naturally. He spoke of rivers beyond the mountains and winters spent beneath endless stars. Elena spoke less, but when she did, she found herself confessing thoughts she had hidden for years. I used to think marriage meant being chosen, she admitted one evening while brushing Rosemary near the fence line. Now I think it means disappearing quietly beside someone else's ambitions. Takoda remained still beside her. Why stay? The question sounded simple. They made it painful. Because women like me are taught to endure. And are you happy enduring? Elena could not answer. That night, Richard hosted several wealthy cattle buyers at the ranch house. The dinner stretched endlessly beneath bright chandeliers and forced laughter. Elena tried participating in conversation, but Richard interrupted repeatedly. No, Elena, that's not the route I mentioned. You're misunderstanding the figures. You needn't concern yourself with business matters. Each correction arrived politely enough to avoid public embarrassment, yet sharp enough to diminish her piece by piece. By dessert, she barely spoke at all. Later, after the guests retired downstairs for whiskey and cigars, Elena stood alone in her bedroom, fighting unexpected tears. A knock sounded at the door. She quickly wiped her face. Yes. Richard entered while loosening his collar. Tomorrow I'll be traveling south for 2 days. Elena stared at him numbly. Of course. You sound disappointed again. No, she said quietly. Just tired. Richard studied her briefly before speaking words that hollowed the room completely. You've become difficult to please, Elena. Then he left. She remained motionless long after the door closed. Near midnight, unable to breathe beneath the weight of the house any longer, Elena slipped outside toward the stables. Wind moved gently through the dark fields while distant thunder murmured beyond the hills. A lantern still glowed faintly inside the barn. Takoda looked up as she entered. For one dangerous moment, neither spoke. Then he noticed the tears she had failed to hide. Without thinking, he stepped toward her, and Elena did not step away. The things they could no longer deny. Takoda stopped a few feet away from Elena, the lantern light flickering softly across the barn walls between them. Outside, wind whispered through the trees while distant thunder rolled deeper into the mountains. Neither spoke immediately. Elena hated how relieved she felt simply standing near him. You shouldn't be here this late, Takoda said quietly. I know. Yet she made no move toward the door. The silence stretched, carrying all the words both had avoided for weeks. Takoda studied her carefully, his expression restrained but troubled. Did he hurt you? He asked. The question startled her. No, Elena answered after a pause. Richard doesn't strike people. He prefers smaller injuries. Takoda's jaw tightened. Elena looked down at her trembling hands. I used to think loneliness meant being alone, but it's worse waking beside someone who no longer sees you at all. The confession hung heavily in the dim barn. Takoda stepped closer, though caution remained visible in every movement. You are seen. Her breath caught softly. No one had spoken to her that way in years. She should have left then. She knew it. Every instinct warned her that standing beside him in the quiet darkness was already dangerous. Yet danger had begun to feel strangely alive compared to the emptiness waiting inside the ranch house. Takoda reached for the lantern hanging nearby and lowered the flame slightly. Shadows deepened around them. Elena, he said carefully, people already watch too closely. I don't care. You should. For the first time, sharp emotions surfaced beneath his calm exterior. A married woman visiting me alone at night will not end peacefully. Elena lifted her eyes to his. And what if peace already ended long ago? Takoda said nothing. That silence became answer enough. The following days unfolded with growing tension neither could control. Elena tried avoiding the stables, but absence only sharpened her thoughts of him. Ordinary routines became unbearable. Meals with Richard felt colder. Conversations sounded distant and hollow. Meanwhile, Takoda kept his distance deliberately. When she approached, he often found reasons to leave. If their eyes met across the ranch yard, he looked away first. The restraint hurt more than rejection. By the fourth day, Elena finally rode beyond the northern pasture alone, desperate for space from the suffocating quiet inside herself. Dark clouds gathered overhead as she followed the river trail toward the hills. Wind bent the tall grass sideways while thunder echoed closer than before. Rosemary grew restless beneath her. Then rain began suddenly. Within minutes, the narrow trail turned slick with mud. Elena attempted turning back, but Rosemary panicked at a crack of lightning and jerked violently sideways. The mare slipped near the riverbank. Elena! Takoda's voice cut through the storm. He rode down from the ridge at full speed, reaching her just as Rosemary stumbled again near the water. Takoda grabbed the bridle firmly, calming the terrified horse before helping Elena dismount beneath the rain. You could have been thrown into the river, he said sharply. I didn't ask you to follow me. No, he replied, breathing hard, but I followed anyway. Rain soaked through Elena's dress while thunder shook the valley around them. For several seconds they stood motionless beneath the storm, emotions stripped raw by exhaustion and restraint. Then Elena finally broke. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Takoda's expression softened instantly. Do what? Pretend my life doesn't feel empty. Tears mixed with rain against her cheeks. Pretend I'm still loved. Pretend I don't wait every day for moments beside you, because they're the only times I feel alive. Takoda closed his eyes briefly as though the words physically wounded him. Elena, no, she said shakily. You deserve the truth at least once. The storm raged louder around them. When I'm with you, she continued, I remember who I used to be before everything became silence. Takoda stepped toward her slowly. Every trace of restraint remained visible in the tension of his shoulders. You are asking for something dangerous. I know. You belong to another man. The statement should have ended everything. Instead, Elena reached for his hand. The contact sent visible shock through him. His fingers instinctively tightened around hers before he caught himself. You touched something deep inside me, she whispered. Takoda looked at her as though the world had suddenly become unsteady beneath his feet. For one suspended moment, neither cared about consequences. He lifted his hand gently to her face, brushing rain-damp hair from her skin with unbearable tenderness. Elena leaned into the touch instinctively, her eyes closing briefly beneath the warmth of his palm. Then he kissed her, softly at first, carefully, like a man fighting himself even while surrendering. The kiss deepened with all the longing both had buried beneath restraint and guilt. Elena gripped the front of his shirt as years of loneliness cracked open inside her chest. Takoda held her as though afraid she might disappear if released too quickly. When they finally pulled apart, Both were breathing unevenly. "This cannot happen again," Takoda said hoarsely, though his hand still rested against her waist. Elena saw the conflict in his eyes. Duty against desire. Honor against longing. Neither side had won. A sudden sound snapped through the rain behind them. Horse hooves. Takoda turned immediately toward the ridge above the river, his expression sharpening. Through the curtain of rain, a distant rider disappeared between the trees. Someone had seen them. Elena felt fear rush coldly through her body. Takoda's gaze remained fixed on the empty ridge. "You need to go back now. What if they tell Richard?" "They will." The truth landed heavily between them. Elena looked at him one final time before mounting Rosemary with trembling hands. Takoda steadied the reins silently, but neither dared touch again. As she rode back toward the ranch through the storm, guilt and exhilaration twisted painfully together inside her chest. For the first time since her marriage began, Elena Whitmore understood something irreversible. She was no longer fighting temptation. She was already lost to it. The price of being seen. The ranch no longer felt merely tense. It felt watched. Elena sensed it in the silence that followed her through town, in the sudden pauses between conversations when she entered a room, and in the guarded expressions of the ranch workers whenever Takoda passed nearby. Rumors moved quickly across the frontier. Truth moved even faster when people hungered for scandal. Richard said little at first. That frightened her more than anger would have. For 3 days after the storm, he observed everything quietly. He watched Elena during meals. He noticed when she drifted toward the windows overlooking the stables. He noticed Takoda avoiding the main house entirely. Most of all, he noticed the distance growing between himself and his wife. One evening, while servants cleared dinner plates from the table, Richard finally spoke. "People in town seem unusually interested in my household lately." Elena's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. "Frontier towns survive on gossip." "Yes," Richard replied calmly. "But gossip usually begins somewhere." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "What exactly are you asking?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her with unsettling patience. "I'm asking whether my generosity has been mistaken for blindness." The room suddenly felt too small. Elena tried to steady her breathing. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" He rose slowly from his seat. "Because lately my wife disappears whenever storms arrive, and my Apache horse trainer seems unable to look either of us in the eye." The bitterness in his voice sharpened on the final words. Elena stood carefully. "Takoda has done nothing wrong." Richard laughed once without humor. "Interesting that you defend him before I accused him." Silence struck between them like a physical blow. For the first time in years, Richard looked genuinely wounded beneath his anger. Not heartbroken, possessive, like a man realizing something he owned no longer belonged entirely to him. "You embarrass me," he said quietly. The words should have filled Elena with guilt. Instead, exhaustion answered first. "You humiliated me long before this," she replied. Richard's expression darkened instantly. "Be careful." "No," Elena said, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I spent 3 years being careful." She left him standing alone in the dining room. That night, she rode toward the canyon cabin just beyond the eastern ridge. Takoda was already there. A small fire crackled inside the abandoned structure while wind pressed softly against the wooden walls. The moment Elena entered, Takoda saw the fear in her face. "He knows," she whispered. Takoda closed his eyes briefly. "I told you this would happen. I didn't care. That's the problem." His tone carried frustration, but beneath it lived something far more dangerous, concern. Elena stepped closer. "Do you regret it?" Takoda looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Every hour I tell myself I should." "But you don't." "No." The honesty between them had become impossible to escape. Takoda moved toward her slowly, touching her face with roughened fingers. Elena leaned into him instinctively, desperate for the comfort she could no longer deny herself. When he kissed her this time, restraint vanished completely. Months of buried longing surfaced all at once. Grief, desire, loneliness, hunger for tenderness neither had expected to find. Elena wrapped her arms around him as though holding together the broken pieces of herself. Takoda kissed her with equal desperation, like a man fully aware he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills once again. Inside the cabin, the world narrowed to breath and warmth and dangerous relief. For a brief moment, Elena forgot guilt entirely. Then the cabin door exploded inward. Richard stood in the entrance holding a revolver. Rain lashed violently behind him, while fury transformed his face into something almost unrecognizable. Elena stumbled backward in shock. Takoda immediately stepped in front of her. Richard's eyes locked onto them both, taking in every detail with brutal clarity. Elena's flushed face, Takoda's hand still at her waist, the intimacy neither could explain away. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Richard spoke through clenched teeth. "You brought him here." The accusation aimed at Elena sounded more shattered than furious. Takoda kept his voice controlled. "Put the gun down." Richard ignored him completely. "After everything I gave you." Elena stared at her husband with sudden clarity. "You gave me a house, Richard, not love." The words hit harder than any bullet could have. Richard looked physically shaken by them. "You belong to me," he snapped. "No," Elena answered quietly. "That's the problem. You think love means ownership." Richard raised the revolver instinctively toward Takoda. "And what does he offer instead?" Takoda's expression remained calm, despite the weapon aimed directly at him. "Freedom." The word ignited something violent inside Richard. He lunged forward. The gun fired into the cabin ceiling as Takoda slammed into him. The two men crashed against the table, splintering wood across the floor. Elena screamed and rushed toward them while thunder shook the cabin walls. Richard struck Takoda across the jaw with savage force. Takoda retaliated instantly, driving him backward against the wall hard enough to knock the revolver loose across the floorboards. "Elena, move back," Takoda shouted, but she couldn't. Everything had shattered too quickly. Richard struggled upright, breathing heavily, his face twisted with humiliation more than hatred now. He looked at Elena, not at Takoda, but at her. And for the first time, she saw the terrible truth settle into him completely. She truly loved another man. That realization hollowed him. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, as though something inside him had finally collapsed under its own weight. Outside, rain hammered against the canyon rocks while silence slowly filled the cabin again. Takoda stepped protectively closer to Elena, his breathing uneven from the fight. Richard stared at them both with devastated disbelief. Then, quietly and dangerously, he said, "If you walk out with him tonight, there is no returning from it." Elena looked toward Takoda, and for the first time, she realized love alone might not be enough to save either of them.